伊恩·邓肯史密斯爵士是英国政坛保守派的代表性人物，已经活跃于英国的国会将近30年的时间。他在2001年到2003年担任过英国保守党的党魁，在英国前首相卡麦隆的任内当过6年的内阁大臣，也相当受到现任英国首相强生的器重。在脱欧的问题上，他和强生同一阵线，认为脱欧之后能够帮助英国摆脱来自欧盟的束缚。不过，在对中国大陆的政策上，史密斯爵士的态度则是明显比强生强硬许多。史密斯爵士目前担任对华政策跨国议会联盟 IPAC 的共同主席，认为中国大陆的野心会威胁到全球民主。多次在英国国会中琢磨于新疆和香港的人权议题，正被高呼要英国更加注意来自中国大陆的威胁，这也让史密斯爵士成为中国大陆的眼中钉，在今年3月份把他列入了制裁名单当中。不过，史密斯爵士却表示，能够被列入中国大陆的制裁名单，对他来说其实是个荣誉的勋章。今天我们非常荣幸邀请到了史密斯爵士，进行了跨海视讯专访，和我们一起来聊一聊他的想法。Good morning, Sir Ian. It is a great honor for me to interview you. Would you like to say hi to your audience here in Taiwan?
Yes, I certainly would. I'd also know that your audience probably has one person who is my brother-in-law who is working in Taiwan at the moment.
Really? Good. Yeah. Okay, so I would like to start our interview today with a question regarding IPAC, which was established in June last year. We know that you are the co-chair of IPAC, and why did you and other like-minded members of Parliament establish IPAC? Please share your ideas about how democracies can operate together to protect the Indo-Pacific region, and what has IPAC achieved over the past year?
Well, IPAC was formed here in the UK. The principle was that we would seek to find kindred spirits who are concerned about the nature of the Chinese government and their behavior, which is getting worse, so externally and internally. And so what we did was set out to see how many people there were around the world that parliamentarians, that's politicians, who would take part. In fact, we therefore have co-chairs have to be one on the left and one on the right. And we now have 20 countries, and we have well over 200 parliamentarian members of IPAC, from Japan through to the United States, including countries in the Indo-Pacific region, also a couple in Africa and a number in Europe as well. So this is bringing together politicians who are deeply concerned about it. And the idea is to bring pressure to bear on China through the free world to change their behavior, or at least to alert the free world to the growing danger of an unrestrained China whose ambitions are internally and externally really quite worrying. So then we got on to, it was through IPAC that Adrian Zenz published his information last year about, which he had gleaned from Chinese official reports about the human rights abuses taking place in Xinjiang amongst the Uyghur, and that has made everyone sit up and realize that there's probably a genocide taking place there. And then there was the Hong Kong ending of the Hong Kong Sino-British agreement, which was done breaching international law, and the abuse and the crackdown on democracy protesters, peaceful ones, who are now either languishing in prison or have fled, some to the UK and to other countries, and then raising other objections like the takeover of the South China Seas, the threats to Taiwan, and the clashes on the border of India, and also then the Belt and Road projects. It's got wider and wider as more and more people have joined and raised particular concerns. But it's not popular in Beijing, I know that for a fact, because I and almost the whole of all those who have been sanctioned, including myself, yes, are all members of IPAC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we know that you in the British Parliament, you are one of the most influential voices on China. But I'm reading from your report before, I know that your family used to have deep connections with China. And could you please tell us more? And what about yourself?
Well, yes, my great-grandfather, who had been in the Far East during the mid-19th century. He settled in Fuzhou and set up a trading business in the port of Fuzhou. And whilst there, he married, and his children, my grandmother and my uncle, my grandmother was born there, and she married an Englishman who came out to set up the Chinese postal system across China. He did it originally, I think, under Sun Yat-sen and then eventually under the nationalist government, and that was quite successful because I think it carried on working pretty effectively for many, many years. And then their children, my mother and my uncle, were born there. My uncle was fluent in Mandarin and also spoke very good Cantonese. My grandfather was the same. And my uncle then fought with the Chinese against the Japanese invasion during the Second World War, based in Chongqing, but all over the place. And so there's been strong connections. I still have some family on my grandmother's side who still live in around the area, including Taiwan.
Yeah, but you have been a strong critic about China's policies on human rights, and you led much of the campaign about China in Parliament. Why are you so strongly opposed to the CCP? Is it because of your own personal experiences?
Well, most importantly, the reason why I worry about the behavior of the CCP, because I think since the arrival of President Xi, it's got a lot more aggressive internally and externally. It wasn't great before, but it's now much, much more aggressive. And his plans for China are very clear, to be the largest economy, which they may well be in the next 10 or 15 years, although we'll see. And certainly with that, to have the most potent military to be able to at least stand off the United States and its allies. And these are ambitions mostly at the moment aimed at its neighbors, particularly Taiwan, of course, where, as we all know, that the Chinese government's view, the CCP's view, is that Taiwan is a part of China, and therefore either they get it back by peaceful means or any other means, and that's the worrying factor. But with that comes all the aggression on its external borders. I mean, the takeover of the South China Seas, is quite outrageous, really, because they have no historic rights there. And Vietnam and the Philippines and others have just been essentially pushed to one side. And then, of course, India, which I think sometimes the CCP fears a rise in, India rising and becoming more effective because, of course, its scale and its size and the fact that it sits on the southern border of China. So their aggressive behavior there. But then, most of all, it's the human rights abuses now, which are absolutely tragic. Not just the Uyghur, but we know about the Tibetans in forced labor camps, the slave labor from the Uyghur, the sterilization of the Uyghur women and the separation of the children into schools where they're taught to be essentially Han Chinese, not to have any ethnicity that is other than that. I understand that the Inner Mongolians in the northern part of China are beginning to suffer the same fate, where their language is being banned and their ethnicity is to be denied. And this goes on, and it's a government which is, I think, turning out to be pretty brutal at home and pretty brutal abroad. And I think the free world's got to wake up to the fact that we have created this growing problem because we've stuck so much money in there and invested so much and run for cheap labor that it is our creation.
Yeah, I understand that you've been to Hong Kong before, and since the handover to China in 1997, Hong Kong has changed significantly. And as a British MP and minister, and one of the most influential political figures in UK, how do you see the current situation in Hong Kong?
Well, I think it's unsustainable. I think that what's going on now is an end to the one country, two systems model. I mean, they're not even making any kind of pretense that exists. And then the second element to that, which is really quite damaging, is the brutality with which this is now being enforced. So they're sweeping aside the basic tenet. And this was, of course, because China, the CCP at the time, wanted to keep Hong Kong as a place where inward investment could be made and leveraged. And one of the reasons for that, which is really where I think that there is a way forward, is that the Chinese government understands the fact that China in civil and business law it's still a common law state. That is to say, English common law is the way that is governed. And that essentially makes it much easier for Western companies to be able to invest through Hong Kong, because the business relations are governed by probably the most flexible and best legal system in the world, which is English common law, which is, as you may or may not know, is more and more adopted around all the developing world, the Far East, etc. Of course, it's in America, Canada, it's ours obviously in the UK. And the fact that they still have common law suggests to me that they don't, even though Hong Kong's the dominance in the financial institutions has waned over the years as Shanghai has picked up, the one thing that Hong Kong has, which is critical, is common law, and English common law to boot. And it has English judges and English barristers and English legal firms operating in Hong Kong because of common law. So I think one of the areas that I'm beginning to argue is it's time really for us to argue that you can't have English common law alongside a dictatorial and aggressive and brutal legal system that is suppressing people. The whole principle of common law is that it protects the rights of the individuals, and it can't therefore be operating alongside. So we are debating whether or not it's time to pull out the judges.
Yeah, good point. But in March, China imposed sanctions on 10 UK organizations and individuals, including yourself, over what it called the spreading of lies and disinformation about human rights abuses in Xinjiang. How do you respond to the sanctions on you and your family also?
Well, I would rather not have been sanctioned, but having been sanctioned, I accept it as part of the nature of what I'm trying to do at the moment. I mean, the reality is China lashes out at everybody now who says anything about China. They are very sensitive, surprisingly, for a regime that suppresses anybody who dissents. They are very sensitive internationally about criticism. And I think they've blundered in sanctioning people from the West because it just makes it very clear that China now has something to hide. And what they are hiding is the abusive nature of their regime, particularly in their involvement with the minority groups, ethnic minority groups in China. As I say, for many decades, the Tibetans have been tyrannized by China, and the Uyghur now are on an even greater scale. And others too, Christians having their churches smashed and suppressed, and Falun Gong, and of course Hong Kong. So as I said earlier on, what we're getting here is a sense of a government that is very sensitive to criticism, but at the same time obstinately determined.
And just last week, the European Parliament has overwhelmingly passed a resolution to boycott the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics in response to continuing human rights abuses by the Chinese government. And what is your take on this?
Well, I agree with them, and I think that Western governments should boycott these Winter Olympics. I think you can't reward a country that, because it is big, gets away with abusing people's human rights, with torturing people, even ending up in killing them, terrorizing them, and aggressively misbehaving on its borders, and, as I said earlier on, through international agreements and through the normal rules-based order that governs trade at the WTO. They break every one of these areas. And so I think that allow them to have the games as though nothing has happened is a cowardly act from countries in the West who will actually play exactly the way that the Chinese government thinks they will play, which is so scared about their trade links that they dare not criticize China. Well, we need to end that and start calling out China for its abuses. And one of the ways to do that is to highlight that by saying, look, honestly, we shouldn't be doing the Olympic Games. Certainly governments shouldn't have anything to do with it. If individual athletes decide to go, well, be it on their own heads. But the reality is government should say, we are not endorsing these games. And we're arguing that here in the UK as well.
Yeah, good. Over the past 1 year and a half, the whole world has been devastated by COVID-19. And do you support investigating in the sources of the coronavirus?
Of course, we need to know what happened. What we know so far is that the Chinese government suppressed any information about human-to-human transfer as early as certainly the beginning of December 2019. It was pretty clear that it was known, as many scientists and doctors were beginning to report at that stage, and then they were silenced. And it wasn't until late January, really, that the Chinese government accepted and admitted publicly to the WTO that they had a problem. But they played that down to such an extent that the WTO ended up calling it a pandemic only on March the 11th. So in that period where China suppressed the information about what was going on, many Chinese people left and went to do work elsewhere. In northern Italy, there are many factory workers in the clothing area, there are students traveling abroad, and there are also many people traveling into China at the time who would have left China and come back carrying the virus. So this was an act of an irresponsible and arrogant government that put its own reputation ahead of the spreading of a desperate pandemic, which resulted in millions of deaths around the world and more likely to have even more. And I think, therefore, the issue here is how do you make sure this never happens again? And whilst you have a country as large as China and as demonstrably powerful as China that simply refuses to obey the norms of international behavior, then this will happen again. So an inquiry into how. I don't know about the laboratory. I don't make any accusations that it was found in the laboratory or it happened. That is for a full inquiry. But I do know this much. There is no question Chinese government suppressed the reporting to the WTO of the nature of what they knew about this. So no action was taken, and when it was too little and it was too late.
Yeah, so Sir Ian, would you and UK support Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly and WHO? What can be done to stop Taiwan's exclusion from this world organization?
Well, I think, as I remember rightly, Taiwan used to have observer status at the WHO and the WTO, and that's been ended on the insistence of the Chinese Communist Party in government in China. It does seem to me bizarre and cowardly of the WTO and WHO not to recognize that Taiwan must have at least its own status. At least they're able to report on what's happening in Taiwan directly. And there were lots of early issues that took place. It would have been interesting to know exactly what was happening in Taiwan. But this was all suppressed by the Chinese government. So it is, I think it's an act of utter cowardice for the international institutions to bow to the desires of a country called China.
Yeah, last year, Taiwan has been saying that Taiwan can help by donating facial masks and other medical supplies to countries in the world. Sarcastically, this year, due to the outbreak in our local communities, Taiwan is now in desperate need of vaccines. However, China has tried to sabotage Taiwan's efforts in acquiring the much-needed vaccines. How do you see this?
Again, I think this is classic Chinese Communist Party behavior, which is that no other country I know of in the free world would get away with this behavior. We would be condemned, we'd be ostracized, there'd be questions in the United Nations about our behavior. But China gets away with it because too many countries in the West are too indebted and dependent on China because they have run to them to do business. And I tried to point out to them the other day that this dependency is damaging to us. And one of the areas that shows it more than anything else is COVID. The fact is that we are so dependent or became dependent on China for all of these sort of products meant that during the outbreak, countries like the UK simply couldn't get the equipment that was necessary because so much of it was produced in China. And that was, the gowns, the masks for clinical practitioners, many of who died as a result. Now, that kind of dependency is unhealthy, and it led to essentially a huge amount of profit making in many of these Chinese factories, and many in the West, as a result, were unable to get the right equipment. So what Taiwan is seeing at the moment is very much what the West saw during last year's outbreak. So we need to deal with this and deal with it pretty carefully. And in fact, I have here a plastic bottle of an antiviral. And it's quite interesting. In the early part of last year, after it became clear it was a pandemic, UK couldn't get bottles because they were made in China and China was holding them back for itself. Just a little plastic bottle like that shows you how dependent we have lazily become, and we need to change that.
Yeah, correct. 3 U.S. senators sent by President Joe Biden recently visited Taiwan, and in the meantime, Taiwanese government hopes to host important MPs from the UK in the near future to deepen our bilateral exchanges. Will you consider visiting Taiwan, Sir Ian?
Yes, I have actually visited Taiwan in the past. I was there in about, let me get this right, 1995 or 6, I think, something like that, or maybe a little bit earlier, I think maybe 1994. So I visited visited Taiwan at that stage. So yes, we are talking about it at the moment in IPAC about whether we should, when we can go over there and how to do it. And I think at the moment, you as a country are under some pressure from the Chinese military, who I gather are overflying Taiwan regularly, trying to create trouble and forcing Taiwanese military to get their jets into the air to deflect these intrusions in their airspace, which is costly and worrying for you. So I'm sorry about that, but obviously we need to draw attention to that more globally.
Yeah, what is your impression on Taiwanese President Tsai? She graduated from LSE and she's very friendly with the UK. Could you please comment on President Tsai's upholding of liberal democracy and leadership during the pandemic? And do you think it is possible in the future for her to visit the UK?
Well, I think she is exactly doing that, and I think the Taiwanese government is trying to hold on to the democratic norms, which are basically democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. These are all vital to make a balanced state. These are the areas that the Chinese Communist Party absolutely abhors and refuses to implement. So it's a very good example of the alternative to the Chinese Communist Party and their rule. And I think that is one of the reasons why China is so desperate to end Taiwanese independence, as it were, of China, or at least understood to be independent. So it's a dangerous time for you, but I think upholding democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in a difficult time are marks of good leadership.
Yeah, IPAC is an alliance for parliament around the world who support freedom and democracy. And do you foresee and support any Taiwanese legislators to join IPAC in the future?
Well, we are certainly looking at this at the moment to see how far we can extend it. We still haven't yet completed a number of other countries that are important, and we were working on that. So we've got 20 countries so far, but we don't rule it out, that's for sure. But right now, we're looking to ensure that we've got many other countries, which would be perhaps of greater use to Taiwan, to have many more countries involved in IPAC before Taiwan is considered. But as I say, I've met the representative here in London, and I think many in Europe are doing the same. So we are concerned to raise these issues, and certainly we want to help Taiwan as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, thank you so very much for your time and valuable insights, Sir Ian. And may I have my personal request? Before I become a member of the parliament, may I become a media observer, maybe to serve as a bridge between IPAC and Taiwan?
More than welcome. If you ever come over here, do let us know. We're very happy to see you and chat to you. And hopefully, as and when members of IPAC go over there, they will make it vitally important to see you and to talk to you there.
Great. I will need your endorsement in the future. Thank you. No, thank you so very much. And I hope I will visit you in person in the UK in the very near future, and wish all the best. Please stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
And you. And you. And you.
Goodbye.